what ends up happening is it almost becomes either combative, I should say, or paralysis by analysis.
Maybe it didn't work in that one instance.
Exactly.
But if you don't test something at least 3 times, it's not valid.
And they think everything's a hard truth, right? They went to college and the college professor said,
yeah, there's a right or a wrong answer.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
I think that's a great way to put it.
And the reality of marketing, there rarely is a right or wrong answer.
Welcome to Marketing from the Edge podcast. I'm Cody Alexander. I've directly generated over $200 million in net revenue over the last 5 years through innovative marketing and a numbers-first strategy. Joined with me is my dad. John Alexander has become the go-to expert in the direct marketing field, generating over $1.5 billion in revenue over the last 5 years. Sought by both board of directors and 9-figure businesses, he is an owner/founder of Centurion Publishing and is on the journey of growing this brand new business from 0 to 100 million in annual revenue. Today, we've got another controversy on our hands. John comes out with a bold statement. Split tests are bullshit. Here's why. I'm excited for other people to hear this one because you have strong feelings and I think it's going to be fun.
I do. And so here's my raw statement, right? Like everybody in marketing talks about testing, right? Mm-hmm. I would argue or hypothesize that the vast majority of people do it wrong. And so that's why typically when it comes to split tests in general, right? Split tests as a core, my go-to statement is split tests are BS. They're bullshit.
All right. Well, now you got to defend that position. It's starting off hot.
So here's the reason why I say that. For most people, split tests are a crutch. I mean, I know guys that their marketing career goes back to the 70s, right?
Damn.
Mine kind of goes back to the 90s. But if you look at kind of the early 2000s in general, the internet marketing phase and all that stuff coming on, split tests were one of those things that, you know, like Nick Saban would say, it was like rat poison, right? Like you would stick it out there and you'd be like, oh, we're going to teach you all the 37 split tests that you need in order to do this thing, right? You need gold buttons, not blue buttons and blah, 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 right?
Yeah, I equate it, especially at the beginning, it was like giving a diabetic candy.
Yeah.
Right? Did they love it? Yeah, but it's not what they needed.
Exactly. It's like the Staples commercials on the easy button. We're like, oh, we need an easy button, right? Like it was an easy button. And the reality is that split tests are so time sensitive and they're so business specific. There are generalities, right? Like we know we need a CTA, right? If you don't have a call to action, you're not going to sell anything. I can't tell you.
There are hard truths in business.
There are, right? But the vast majority of like a blue button, green button, you know, like the font size on the button, like you couldn't believe some of the shit I heard, right? 7-word headlines instead of 5-word headlines, right? Because that was the key because people think in 7.
3-choice order form versus single choice.
Yeah. And while all those things you should test, right? Number one, you should test them in your industry, right? Which is what most people forget. Like all the caveats everybody used to say when they're like, all right, split tests, right? I'm going to give you the stuff, but you know, they'd always be like, hey, but definitely testing on your shit. Everybody forgot all that. So
it no longer became like what's working for me. It became here's what will work for you, which is just untrue.
And then they tell others, right?
Exactly.
They're like, you've got to have a gold button. You know, that's what I
they'd get up on stage and they would, you know, prophesize and they'd be like, if you're not using gold buttons, you're an idiot.
Exactly. And so when I first got in the financial industry, right, like you end up with a bunch of, I'll say the vast majority of marketers in the financial market, especially if at Agora, right? If we talk about Agora in specific, are 30 and under, right? Yeah. The vast majority of them, it's their first job out of college. The next big chunk, it's their second job out of college.
Yeah.
And they're 30 and under. And so they just don't have a ton of experience. That's why I say most of them are production people in a marketing role.
Yeah, they don't have context.
Exactly.
Some people come in and they have experience in other industries, but they have enough wherewithal to know they've been in enough places. They know what worked at one, didn't work at another. And they think everything's a hard truth, right? They went to college and the college professor said,
yeah, there's a right or a wrong answer.
Yes, exactly. Right? I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And the reality of marketing, there rarely is a right or wrong answer, right?
For very long.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I say, so, you know, I get there and they're talking about stuff and I'm like, hey, we should try this. Oh, we tried that 18 months ago. It didn't work. Okay, well, what didn't work? What about that didn't work? And the market 18 months prior to when I got there, entirely different market.
Yep. And I think where I really align with you, I really challenge people. Whenever you hear the phrase, we already tested that, And you're like, okay, there's a difference between we tried something, we did something, whatever. When someone says we tested it, they are essentially labeling it as wrong to go back to your. They're like, no, that's wrong. And you're like, okay, for what reason?
And maybe it didn't work in that one instance.
Exactly.
But if you don't test something at least 3 times, it's not valid, right? There's all these things that require validity, right? If you don't test it long enough, it's not valid. If you don't test it on multiple different sources, it's not valid. Just because it worked or didn't work on a small scale doesn't mean it'll work or won't work on a large scale.
Yep. And what ends up happening is a lot of the time you put an employee who has great intentions.
Yes.
But maybe not all the pieces of the business, the insight, I should say, not all the insight into the business. And so they go in and they just start, it's almost like black ink over your pencil. Things that you're like, hey, I want to be able to change this in the future. They just ink it out. And they're like, oh, no, that's not right. Or, oh, it needs to be this way. And they'll do that across the business. And all of a sudden you'll look back and you'll be like, man, why is this not working anymore?
Yeah.
And you split tested your way to a failing funnel.
Exactly. And the reality is this isn't to disparage any individual, right? This isn't, hey, look, they're doing it wrong. That's not the case. The case is that they're doing the best they can with the information that they have and the experience they have. And so that's why I used to sit down and over again be like, look, I have a bunch of experience in this marketplace. You've got your experience in the marketplace. I've got an idea of what'll work. You might have an idea of what'll work. Why don't we just test it? So now you got to go through, okay, what's a test look like, right? You got to use the same traffic. You got to split traffic. It's not, you can't run my traffic Monday to Thursday and your traffic Friday through Sunday. That's not a valid split test.
Yeah.
You can't run my traffic on one promo and your traffic on another promo. That's not a valid split test.
Well, and it's why we didn't have split testing in our business for 3.5 years now, ballpark. And just recently, just the last 2 months, we introduced split testing, but it's because we went and we hired a CMO level dude from a company to come, and that's their job is to, I call it maximization, right? Is their job is to maximize every funnel, every opportunity we have. I don't want them to optimize it. And I think those two words are very distinct because you're like,
see, it's funny because I want them to optimize it.
Why I don't want optimization is because you can optimize any one thing.
You can.
But I want them to maximize the funnel.
So when I say, we're going to get on a whole nother subject there, optimization versus maximization, right? So it depends on what you're trying to do, right? For me, I don't care how you get there. Like in my case, I wanted the funnel optimized. By meaning the funnel optimized is I wanted the highest average cart value I could get. I didn't care how you got there. I didn't care whether you maximized the very first offer and you blew off all the rest. I don't care if you went after the 7th offer. I know which one you should go after, which is the first one, because that's where 80% of success comes from.
I had an exact opposite. We just had this come up where we had him run a split test. And it wasn't a bad or flawed split test at all. But what ended up happening is you had this order bump and our average cart value went up $30.
Okay.
But our overall conversion rate on the funnel went down 15%. And what I want the volume because the later lifetime value was greater than that $30.
Yeah, exactly. So you're absolutely right. You can optimize for cart value and destroy what the true purpose is. In this case, orders. So in my case, I'm like, you got to keep the order count up. And what I care about is optimizing that at that order count for.
And that's why I call it maximizing.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I think that it's a little semantic, but I want to go back to, there's a specific example even of a split test. Fundamentally, if that person wasn't at a high enough level to understand that like order volume is more important than average cart value, you could have given up 15% of your orders over the course of, this is something that'll do 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 orders a month over the course of a year. You're giving up 1,000 orders.
And depending on the business, that might have been the right answer.
Yeah.
The right answer might have been like, hey, we need the maximum amount of money now.
Yeah, maybe the lifetime value wasn't as good.
Exactly. Because I need today's dollars, not tomorrow dollars.
Yeah.
Where in your business, you're like, no, what I need is a decent amount of revenue today. But what I really want is the maximum number of customers I can get so that over the course of a period of time,
and it is different for every funnel. Yep. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
But again, that's why split tests are bullshit. Again, back to that same point, because somebody be like, oh, this is what you should do for your funnel. Okay, great. That moved your average cart value.
Yeah.
But for that business, that's not what they were actually after.
Yeah. They would have acted like they did the right thing if you came back and challenged them on it.
Yep.
They're like, no, I did exactly what it is. And you're like, no, you achieved an outcome, but it wasn't the right outcome.
Yeah, it wasn't the right outcome you guys were after.
Right.
Your business was after at the time. And that's, again, why I kind of get wound up on split tests and I go so far with it, is because they become a crutch, right? They really do become somebody's like, oh, well, one choice order forms. That's what we should have because that's what everybody else, and especially in the financial industry, is just incestuous. Like they see somebody else do it and they're like, oh, my God, that must work. I'm like, how do you know? Like, how do you know?
And they'll copy a business that's doing, a fifth of their revenue, and they'll be like, oh, they're doing it, so it must work.
And or they turn around and they're like, oh, look how many front-end orders they're getting every day. So they obviously wouldn't get all those orders, so they weren't turning into money. I'm like, yeah, you can't make that assumption.
Here's one of the reasons why, when and where I would 100% agree with you on split tests or bullshit, is what ends up happening is it almost becomes either combative, I should say, or paralysis by analysis. Like you're trying to analyze it so much that you'd never make a decision. And what you see often is you're like someone who probably doesn't have the same level of insight into the business, has an idea, and you're like, nope, that's not a good idea. And then it's, oh, well, why don't we test it? No, because you're thinking, what if I'm right? All right. But what you're not thinking about is if you're wrong, there's lost value.
Yeah. So a great example of that is one of the things that we rarely messed around with was pricing on webinars.
Yep.
Right. Because there's no real way to split test it.
No.
There's no real valid way to split test it. And because of the revenue you're generating, in our case, it was between $1 and $20 million a webinar.
Jeez.
Like you're such a number that you don't want to take the chance on, yes, maybe you might find an improvement, but probably not after doing 150 of these things, right?
You're adding $200,000 to $600,000.
But the risk was too great against that.
And I think that's such a great point. And I think anyone who would argue against that point is just ignorant of the reality of business, which is sometimes there are too many variables that you cannot control, that it makes any test like that flawed. And I think that's just one of those ones where every time you ran it, you would get a different result, which means that it's not sound.
Because the same promo in July does different than the same promo in August.
And it's a different person behind it.
Exactly.
And it's a different idea.
All those different things. And so, that's why don't use split tests as a crutch, right? Don't listen to what somebody else is telling you. And like I said, I don't want to go too far because I do split test almost everything under the sun. Like I like split testing. So don't get me wrong, but I know that you have to have a statistically significant number of people go through something before you can call it. And I saw that over and over again. I would see guys be like, oh, well, this one's got 12 orders and that one's got 4. So it's obviously going to win. And I'm like, it's been running one day on one traffic source.
Yeah. Like going the other way with it, which is the paralysis by analysis, where you have a variant that was overperforming the first 3 days, then started to underperform the next 3 days, and then came back and overperformed the 3 days after that. And inevitably you have this split test running for 6 weeks because it can't figure out if it wants to overperform and underperform. And here's the problem is generally when it overperforms, it doesn't make up for the lost volume when it underperforms. And so you're like, well, we're just going to keep it going. And it's almost like, oh yeah, we have 2 versions of this page. You're like, okay, then make 2 versions. Figure out where it overperforms, figure out where it underperforms. And like you said,
drive it in that traffic.
Yeah,
exactly.
It becomes a crutch where they're like, oh, we're testing it. You're like, no, you're not testing it. You just don't know what's happening.
Which is fine. We had 2 versions of a promo and both worked equally well.
Exactly.
And so we ran half of them to the place where they worked most effective. We ran the other half. We just kept both versions.
But you're not split testing that point.
No.
You're smart marketing.
Yeah. I just decided I had 2 promos on the same subject.
Yes.
I think one of the other things that comes back is that back in the direct mail days, what used to happen is you'd rent a list. And typically when you first rented a list, what unsavory list owners would do is they would seed that list with known good buyers, right? Typically right off the bat. you would get a great result. You might get 2% on a mailing, which is phenomenal, right? Because 1%'s pretty much adequate in order to do anything you want. And so you'd immediately go out and you'd buy a bunch more names from him, and they would never perform as well. Happened over and over again, which is why I'm so adamant about, if I'm going to split test something, it's got to get enough traffic through it. I want it over a variable period of time. I don't want to look at it over 3 days. I don't want just Facebook traffic source or whatnot. I want a mix of all these things. And I really do, for me, as I'm split testing a lead or split testing an order form or doing something, I am looking at it and going, yeah, if I make a call on this thing, is it the right call? Like, I'm very, very much aware
that you're changing your control. And if you're wrong, there's a cost.
Yeah. And later on down the road, 6 months from now, it might go back to the other direction.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to run split tests, you need them to be valid. You need to make sure that you're controlling as many variables and only changing one variable, which I've seen that a ton, where they change the headline and the price. I'm like, okay, great. Now you got 2 variables.
Yeah.
How do you know what worked?
Wow, shocker.
You know?
Yeah, I have no idea what happened.
And I've seen it from very smart marketers, like very smart marketers.
Well, it's easy because you want to fix it, right? But if you try to fix all of it, you won't know what you fixed or what you broke. I do want to add one more piece to it as well. And this is another trap I see smart marketers fall into, is that they test something that's like a little bit larger scale, like 1 choice order form versus 3 choice order form, or a price point or whatever.
Okay.
And they'll test it and it'll work. They'll be like, holy crap, we just unlocked a huge opportunity in this business. Imagine if we increased everything, all of our order forms by 15% by implementing this across the board. And that's how they think it works.
Yeah.
And they implement it across the board. And guess what happens? You make the same or less orders, because that's not how business is done. That's why if you add a feature to one product and they love it, if you add that feature to every product you have, you don't get the same outcome. You don't get the same reception.
Exactly.
Because it's different.
And that's where, for me, if I'm going to split test price, for instance, right? Like I might split test $79 versus $99. I'll test it in this promo. If I get a good result or even a bad result, I'll look at it. I'll test it in another promo. I always test it at least 3 different places that are unique in terms of whether it's a promotion, whether it's a time period, whether it's a traffic source, whatever. I want a sampling in order to then try to figure it out. And there were times over the course of 2 or 3 years, we might test 2 price points on everything for 2 friggin' years before we felt comfortable enough to be like, hey, that's the price we're going to roll out and do, right? And that's ultimately what we ended up doing at Legacy. We ultimately came up with a price on the front end that we decided this was the optimum price. And it took us about 2 years to decide that price across, you're talking 40 or 50 or 60 promotions over a period of, it was almost 2 years. So you got a bunch of different variables in the financial market. You got a bunch of different variables in the promotion. You got a bunch of variables in the copywriter. You ultimately shove all that together. And then we figured out, all right, 47 was the prime price for what we were trying to accomplish.
A great combination of order volume and lifetime value and, and probably average cart value to reduce your exposure.
Yeah, because we were trying to get a certain percentage of break even on day 0.
Yep.
And that all matched it in. But it's funny because then all of a sudden everybody's using $47. And I'm like, really? Come on. Like, you guys all have your different variables, your different shit. And I did a ton of talking across the Goro world when guys would call me. I didn't really go on stage or anything, but we do all kinds of stuff. And guys would ask, and I'd be like, look, this is what we built and how we built it based on our monetization model and everything else we were doing. And very few people were doing that. So I was always like, look, you got to test it in your world, right? Ours, we had 90 to 180-day LTVs. That's primarily was our focus. We had 2 webinars a month. So I had 2 built-in monetization events literally for every front-end promo. Most people were doing 1 webinar a quarter. There were all kinds of things like that I was constantly trying to tell them, look, don't just take what we're doing and extrapolate into your business and assume it's going to work the same way.
Right.
That's why, again, I used to watch the internet marketers on split tests and be like, they're full of shit. Because in certain markets that works, and in other markets that has no bearing whatsoever.
I think you're absolutely right. And if you don't believe us, split test it.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of these days we'll actually talk about what makes a valid split test too. I think that would be a good subject to cover, because at one point, I had a training for everybody within the marketing department on what a valid split test actually looked like. Because I found out fairly quickly talking to certain guys, I'm like, why'd you? Yeah, we tested that, and this is what we came up with. I'm like, okay, you got 27 orders through the thing. You have a day and a half of traffic. Like that.
That's why
what do you mean
we
you
didn't
tested
even
it?
split test it until we had someone competent in, because you can do more damage than you can do good.
Absolutely, you can.
All right, we found a whole new episode with maximization versus optimization.
Yes.
So keep an eye out
write
for
that one down.
later.
I'll write that one down. That'll be a good discussion.
Well, we don't even have anything to do on the ranch now, so I guess we'll just go to bed or something. All
right. Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to Marketing from the Edge podcast. If you want to hear more of our thoughts every week, visit marketingedgepod.com. We'll share more of our very best lessons, thoughts, strategies for growing a business, as well as some personal stories here from the edge of the world. Invest a couple minutes of your morning and we'll give you the blueprint to growing your business from where it's at today to where you want it to be. That's marketingedgepod.com. If you want to reach out to us directly, feel free to email Cody at marketingedgepod.com and you might get a surprise bonus.